The Force. May it be with you and such. According to Obi-Wan, well, the Force is what gives a Jedi their power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together. Yoda says life creates it, makes it grow. Its energy surrounds us, binds us. He says luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. Chirrut calls it the force of others. Luke tells us that the Force is not a power one has. It's not about lifting rocks, though it can do that, but it's an energy between all things. A tension, a balance, that binds the universe together. But as Rey asks, what is it? 66 and 18 years earlier, Qui-Gon told us more, finally explaining that what the Force actually is a mystical energy field. We know that, but an energy field that we can only sense if we have a sufficient enough amount of midichlorians in our body's cells. The midichlorians continually speak to us, telling us the will of the Force. The Force's will appears spontaneous to living beings, not planned or orchestrated, as one can spontaneously be born with more midichlorians, making them sensitive to it. The Force is nature, life, and light in itself. This is the reason that those who manipulate the Force, twisting it to their will, also known as using the dark side, are so obsessed with control, technology, and resisting the natural tides of life and death. Control is the opposite of life. Oppression is the opposite of hope. These are the light and dark sides of the Force. The Force itself is the light, and twisting it is the dark side. The Jedi Order, based on Coruscant until 19 BBY, was an order of Force users. These Jedi swore to uphold the Force's will, and used it to serve the galaxy in the ways that they saw best served light and life. But you know all this. Star Wars has been about the Jedi from the very beginning. We have 9 films that tell a grand, mythological epic about the Jedi religion's fall, rebirth, and legacy. We know the Jedi. But as Luke Skywalker says in The Last Jedi, the Force does not belong to the Jedi. Anyone can be born with enough midichlorians to feel, manipulate, or twist the Force. What if they are not born into a world that submits their Force-sensitive infants to the Republic and the Jedi Order? What if they are born into a family that belongs to a different Force order? Yes, of course there are other culturally specific religions in Star Wars, with gods and deities and different systems than the Force. But there are also other Force-based religions in the Star Wars universe, and today we're going to talk about them, and what they mean for the galaxy as a whole. Before we get into the real meat of the discussion, we gotta talk about the obvious. The Jedi Order's ancient counterpart. Submitting to the dark side of the Force is the Sith Order. We also happen to know a lot about them from the films, though not nearly as much as the Jedi. But The Rise of Skywalker and its related materials gave us a lot of new information about how they actually operate as a religion, or at least an organization. There are Sith worshippers and cultists based on Exegol, but also around the galaxy, and somewhat operating throughout the Imperial and New Republic eras. And in the end, they all kinda got crushed by some rocks, I guess? Cool. Now, some background. Jedha was the frigid desert moon of the planet Najada, a crystalline world on the far galactic west side of the Mid-Rim, very close to the unknown regions. Incredibly significant to any adherents of the Force, Jedha first appeared in Rogue One, before also meeting its destruction. Why does that keep happening to these things? Anyways, Jedha was one of the first major worlds in galactic history to have a population that sought to explore and philosophize on the nature of the Force, enough to, thousands of years later, be considered as one of the possible locations that scholars theorized that the Jedi Order began. But as seen in Rogue One, Jedi is an incredibly diverse community, and in the film, we see it under the rule of the Empire, not even at its peak as a Force-devout mecca of so many different faiths and creeds coming together in the desert. During the High Republic era, Jedha City was a diverse, multi-faith community of pilgrims from all over the galaxy, visiting sites significant to their many faiths. These faiths, due to the Empire's oppression during the time of Rogue One, were much more common in the galaxy during the High Republic, over 300 years earlier, though they absolutely weren't as much household names as the Jedi and the Sith in the galaxy due to the immense history of those two groups. Still, These were significant Force religions who all visited the city and had some sort of presence in the galaxy outside of that. Around 382 BBY, leaders from various Force religions, including the Jedi, formed an advisory council for the city, a group with representatives from every major religion that met to promote understanding and co-working between the groups. I'm going to use this council, called the Convocation of the Force, as a basis to discuss the prominent Force religions in Star Wars canon. The Church of the Force was a rather ancient religion of those who wished to follow the teachings of the Jedi Order, yet were not able to manipulate the Force themselves. The Church of the Force worshipped the Force, and therefore the light as the omniscient power that it was, and sought to bring themselves as close to nature as they could, practicing somewhat primitive lifestyles in order to center themselves to the will of the Force. Interestingly, the Church of the Force managed to survive Order 66, as they weren't any kind of actual Force threat to the Empire, though they were oppressed for spreading Jedi teachings, and moved underground. But the Church maintained hope that the Jedi Order would return to its former glory, and because of this contributed to a lot of the preservation of the Jedi Order's history. The most prominent known member of the Church of the Force is Lor San Tekka, a member of the famous San Tekka family. Lor was an explorer who became a member of the Church of the Force and preserved a lot of history that he handed over years later to his friend and ally Luke Skywalker, whose efforts restored the Jedi Order on Ossus. Some members of the Church of the Force settled on Jakku in the village seen at the beginning of The Force Awakens. The Sorcerers of Thund were a group of Force users from the Outer Rim world of Thund. They were incredibly mystical in their beliefs, but in a more traditionally magic sort of way. They dressed in red cloaks and referred to the Force not as the Force, but as the Unity, and said, "May the Union dwell in your heart," instead of "May the Force be with you." The Sorcerers operated firmly within the light side of the Force, but their usage of it manifested as orange, fire-like magic. Sorcerers who would fall into the dark side could be even more dangerous though, as seen on the planet Kifex around 433 BBY, when a sorcerer who'd fallen attacked a village, before the Jedi stepped in and stopped him. The Sorcerers of Thund first appeared outside of canon in the 1983 book Lando Calrissian and the Mind Harp of Sharu, where they were absolutely Darksiders in that continuity, being a secretive sect of elusive shapeshifters descended from the Sith. This is not true of their canon counterparts, at least from what we know, as they seem to pretty sternly denounce the darkness. The Disciples of the Wills were, by the Imperial era, regarded as the oldest faith on Jedha. Disciples dressed in long, thick, red robes. They also worshipped the Force and wanted to focus on the Force's will and trying to hear it, rather than sensing its presence or trying to manipulate it. Worshipping at the Temple of Kyber, the large, metronome-shaped, tallest building in Jedha City, the Disciples focused on a lot of social work, even running an orphanage and generally caring for all living beings in the city, no matter their creed. Interestingly, while the Disciples did see the Force in light and dark sides, they were much more hesitant to strictly denounce the dark side, and believed that balance existed only within the presence of light and dark, which on a cosmic level does make sense, especially considering that they were not actually using the Force, more hearing it. This brings up another group similar to the Disciples, the Guardians of the Wills. The Guardians were an affiliated organization who also worshipped the Force, yet they were a more martial group, practicing combat and being the de facto defenders of the city, fighting or suppressing uprisings or violence on Jedha. The lightbow was the traditional weapon of the Guardians of the Wills, and was handcrafted by Guardians as a final rite of training while they pursued physical perfection. The Guardians operated out of, and were pretty much synonymous with, the Kyber Temple, and were incredibly ancient, with some scholars believing them to be as old or even preceding the Jedi Order, though this is not known for certain. The Guardians saw less of a distinction between the light and dark sides, and saw them working in tandem much more than the Jedi and Sith did, and this might have something to do with the Guardians of the Wills preferring action themselves, and being warrior monks by definition, instead of just keepers of the peace like the Jedi. The Guardians wanted to not only understand the Force, but to be one with it, and it with them, a phrase well known by members of the faith. During the Imperial occupation of Jedha, the Guardians were more of a nuisance than a defense force, as their temple was sacked and they were forced onto the streets. Instead of the classic "May the Force be with you," the Guardians called the Force of others, saying, "May the Force of others be with you," which was actually a reference to George Lucas's older drafts of Star Wars, which were also titled From the Journal of the Wills, which is where these Wills groups get their name. And if you didn't get it already, Chirrut and Baze from Rogue One are Guardians of the Whills. Another group, the Fenasi, have been a part of Star Wars for years, but also appeared on the Convocation. Interestingly, the Fenasi were all about visual deception with their use of the Force. They were incredibly powerful, and would often pour so much of themselves into the cosmic force to attain great abilities in force projection, or what they referred to as simul futuris. Luke Skywalker studied the Fenasi arts, which were recorded in the ancient Jedi texts. In order to do this on Crate, the Fenasi saw the cosmic force as a great sea, with the light side being called the white current, and the dark side being called the dark tide. In Legends, the Fenasi were a mostly all-female group who also focused on illusions and projections above all else, completely ignoring actual physical manipulations of the universe. The Fenasi first and most iconically appear in the Black Fleet Crisis trilogy. The Matukai also originally hail from Legends, but appear represented on the Convocation as well. Though not a lot is known about them in canon, their Legends lore describes them as a religion that focused on using the Force in tune with their physical body, worshipping through exercise and achieving physical prowess, and being very martial arts based. Beginning as a nomadic order that the Jedi once asked to join their order, the Matukai chose to remain separate, until the days of Luke Skywalker's new Jedi Order in Legends, when some of them joined the more open-minded iteration. Both in Legends and canon, the Matukai wielded long, halberd-like weapons called Wan Shen that they used in combat. The Lanto are one of the most interesting groups, not being strictly a religion, but a Force-sensitive species who worship the light side of the Force. The Lanto were incredibly in tune with nature, and used the Force in a special way that allowed them to manipulate and control plant life, and even heal others using plants. Deeply connected to nature and the Force flowing through all living things, the Lanto would often use vines to fight or preserve order, with the ability to grow roots out of the ground to subdue others and lift themselves high above the ground being particularly useful. And the Lanto had some sort of history involving a religion called the Yakom, a group of Force-sensitive individuals that once used the dark side, but had renounced it by the time of the High Republic, petitioning to join the Convocation of the Force, but later withdrawing following a somewhat violent response to their reputation as Darksiders. The Yakom wore these distinct big black and purple robes and only spoke through proxies. Another group known as the Path of the Open Hand was a religion started on the Outer Rim agricultural planet Dalna by a defected Guardian of the Whills. Believing the Force was sacred, members of the Path worshipped the Force and its will, but saw using it or manipulating it in any way, even very slightly, as completely heretical, thinking it would lead to disastrous butterfly effect type consequences. They saw the Force's energy as finite, so if someone were to use it somewhere, it would be absent elsewhere, causing natural disasters, diseases, or any kind of misfortune, which of course is not how the Force works. Around 382 BBY, the group grew vigilant and eventually violent against those who used the Force, and eventually petitioned to join the Convocation as well, but very quickly came into conflict with other religions using the Force, demanding that they stop, which was the spark that led to the incredibly deadly Battle of Jedha, and another battle soon after with the Jedi Order on Dalna. The citizens of Dalna and surviving members of the Path viewed this battle on Dalna with the Jedi as a massacre and blamed the Jedi. And this isn't as much about their religion, but the Path of the Open Hand also had creatures called the Nameless that could kill anyone who uses the Force, turning them into a stone statue and becoming an issue much later in the timeline. This brings us to the end of the groups present on the Convocation of the Force, which is an incredibly interesting organization to me. In a universe with physical, science fiction style supernatural forces at play, with a known ontological good, religion is a very fascinating concept. What does belief look like when faith is not as heart-based as it is in our world? Would this push interfaith discussions further into vigilance, with different groups refusing to cooperate because of different interpretations? Or would the fact that there is an ontological good emphasize similarities in beliefs, something like Abrahamic religions or the Guardians of the Whills and the Disciples of the Whills, but with a more tangible sense of similarities? The Convocation's existence as an interfaith council seems to imply that there was particularly large amounts of cooperation possible in the galaxy far, far away as far as religion goes. But when presented with groups like the Path of the Open Hand, it becomes much more complicated, as the Force is a very real thing in the Star Wars universe, and could lead to really crazy misinterpretations that could cause religious conflict, like we see in the High Republic. Because religious conflicts based on differing interpretations of things have never happened in our world. No. Of course they have. But Star Wars to me exists as a powerful mirror for reflecting aspects of our own world back at us in a new light, and I think that the convocation, and more so these interfaith conflicts, could really do so in the right artist's hands. Moving past the convocation, we have a few more Force religions to cover. Very famously, the Night Sisters were a group of witches from the planet Dathomir, or actually, Peridia, I guess? I don't know. The group was incredibly ancient and practiced a form of dark side magic that was specifically boosted by a magical ichor that came from deep within Dathomir, but if it's Peridia, I don't know. These abilities were very arcane, boasting many magical qualities like shapeshifting, the creation of ghosts and spirits, raising the dead, strengthening those who are living, and even manifesting objects out of thin air. The Night Sisters were a very survivalism-focused group, who would use anything at their disposal to support their clan, causing them to thoroughly exist in the dark side, though they didn't always see it that way. Being matriarchal and ruled by great mothers, the Night Sisters viewed males or Night Brothers as fodder or breeders, living separate from them. The Night Sisters are very prominent in the Clone Wars, but were later decimated by General Grievous at Sidious's command, leading to Night Sisters being very few past the execution of Order 66. Another ancient religion, possibly hailing from Peridia as well, was the Zepho religion, from the Jedi video game series. The Zephonians, an alien race, hailed from the world Zepho, and were Force-sensitive, referring to the Force as the life wind. Some highly sensitive members of this species became sages, and were revered as gods by their society, with their beautifully ornate tombs being guarded by ancient and powerful robotic creations. Over time, the Zepho as a culture slowly fell to the dark side, leading to their collapse and mysterious disappearance into the unknown regions. Another order briefly seen in the Clone Wars is the Deyan Order. Based on the planet Bardota, this group was a monastic order that sought to achieve a personal oneness with the Force, through meditation and seclusion in the mountains of Bardota. The Degonians tried to never use the Force, thus avoiding the light and dark divide completely, just focusing on feeling it and obeying it. And while based on the Force, the Deyan Order was part of everyday life on Bardota, as its council ruled the planet and served as a school for Bardotans. You may remember Jar Jar and Mace Windu visiting the Degonians. Some Bardotans splintering from the Degonians were also known as the Frangal cult, a different religion which was kind of like a dark side version of the Order, and they worshipped a Bardotan god. Also present on Jedha is the Brotherhood of the Beatific Countenance, a long name for an organization that we don't really know much about, other than that they worship the Force in some way and value the complete stripping of individuality. Interestingly, they appear in the same comics as the Convocation of the Force, but aren't on the Council for some reason, I'm not sure. But what I am sure about is there are probably a lot of other small Force religions in maybe canon, but definitely legends that we don't know as much about, and I'm sure that I've missed at least one that people in the comments will remind me of. And lastly, we have the Elders of the Path, a group descended from the Path of the Open Hand. This group saw the Force like fire. It's real and powerful, yet should always be appreciated from a distance, which was a clear development on what the Path viewed, but a little less extreme, as the Elders of the Path separated during the Path's descent into defeat. The Elders of the Path were a secretive and monastic organization, living in communal settings, which saw elders and acolytes relationships as the core of their group, rather than parents and children. And that's the last Force religion that we know a lot about in canon. The Force is so interesting to me, when we're speaking about it in a way that we are real-world religions, because the Force operates in such a different way in-universe than how we see religion working in our world, in terms of faith and how we interact with it. But there also are some pretty distinct similarities too. It is important to note that in developing the Jedi Order's view of the Force as seen in the Star Wars saga films, George Lucas was majorly inspired by Taoism, Zen Buddhism, and his experience with Christianity, all mashed up together in one system that is kind of contradictory to all three of those religions at the same time, because of just how oddly George chose to mix it. But still, I absolutely must reiterate what I said earlier. There is so much to say about people and our innate sense of humanity, our needs, and our seeking of community in analyzing religion in fiction, and I really think Star Wars could do with more of it. Thanks for joining me on this journey. My reading recommendation for this video is the High Republic 2022 Marvel Comics series. This wonderful 10-issue series by Cavan Scott depicts the Battle of Jedha and is the source of the convocation of the Force and many of the religions featured in this video. You don't even have to read anything else from the High Republic if it's too intimidating. This stands alone beautifully and I can't recommend it enough.